Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer. It is time for somewhat of an off-topic news post. This has been the biggest scandal in gaming at the moment, and there's been a little bit of connections drawn to Path of Exile through their majority owner of GGG, Tencent Holdings Limited. So I wanted to quickly cover it, even though I think there is a lot of coverage of it elsewhere. I think that everything that I've watched on this scandal has been missing something, so that's why I thought I'd put out a video on it as well. I will make a quick apology for my pronunciation of Chinese names here. Some will be wrong, and for that I do apologize. And the scandal relates to Blizzard Entertainment retaliating against Hearthstone champion player Ng Wai Chung, who's known in esports circles as Blitzchung, for him using his post-tournament interview after winning a major Hearthstone tournament to come out and support the anti-government protests that are happening in Hong Kong at the moment. And as the Chinese government is very close to the Hong Kong government, they're extremely hostile to these protests. And so this led to a bit of a scandal and to Blizzard launching a very severe crackdown. So Blizzard's initial statement is currently showing up here. This is the initial statement where they disqualified Ng Wai Chung from the tournament retroactively, cancelling his prize money and banning him from Hearthstone competitive play for a period of a year, and also sacking the two Blizzard contractors that were involved in the interview. They then backed down partially from this, which I believe has only happened in the last few hours, and they reinstated the prize money and halved the length of the ban, but the damage had already been done. So, I want to talk quickly about a disclaimer of bias. I'm a political person, but this isn't a political channel. It's about a game, not about my political ideas. So I'm trying to keep this as neutral as I can and to explain views that I don't agree with fairly. But as anyone that knows me in real life would know, I'm from the radical left politically, and I do support the other Hong Kong protests unconditionally. However, I'm still going to try to explain the position of people from other political persuasions. So that includes Chinese nationalists that oppose the protests, and also other viewpoints that support the protests in Hong Kong, and to do so as fairly as I can. As always, do your own research and ask questions of at least a couple of people from each side in order to formulate your own position. And finally, I don't believe it's possible for entertainment as a whole to be exempt from politics, although individual works can be. We tend not to notice politics in games when those politics are uncontroversial in our own countries. And so, for instance, if you take Wolfenstein 3D, the original Escape from Castle Wolfenstein, it's about a Polish-American prisoner's attempts to escape a Nazi dungeon through the use of cunning and violence. Now, this is a very political theme that's pretty much completely uncontroversial today, as basically everyone agrees that Allied soldiers, and especially Allied prisoners of war, were justified in using deadly force in self-defense and in order to further their escape. But that is still a political statement, and the Super NES port of the game was actually ridiculed for removing these political statements from the game by removing all of the Nazi insignia from the enemies. Now, even if a game makes no overt political statements, like Path of Exile or like Hearthstone, once you include live online play and competitive events, you have a recipe for political statements. So, firstly, I want to talk quickly about sport and politics. There has been a long history of winners and also of particularly winners of political sports using their platform that they gained from that to make a political statement, and of sport authorities repressing them in traditional sports. So whilst this is the first time that it's come up in esports, there's certainly been many examples in athletics, in team sports and the like. So just a few Australian and US-centered examples from the left, from the political left. Colin Kaepernick in the US NFL, Damien Hooper in the 2012 Olympics from boxing, Nikki Winmar in Australian rules football, Kathy Freeman after her win in the 400-metre dash at the Sydney 2000 Olympics, and John Carlos and Tommy Smith in the 200-metre dash at the 1968 Olympics. All of these come to mind as examples. Also from the political right, there's a number of conservative sports people who have done similar things. Two Australian examples that come to mind are Israel Folau and post-retirement Margaret Court. So not so much when she was a tennis champion, but later on in her life. Of these people, Kaepernick, Carlos, Smith and Folau faced significant consequences. Hooper, Winmar, Freeman and Court did not. Similar things have also been seen in non-sports entertainment. Examples of people on the political conservative end of the spectrum being Roseanne Barr's famous 2018 tweet. And from the left side of the spectrum, all of the people that were driven out of Hollywood by the House Un-American Activities Commission, purging it of anyone seen as being even remotely close to the political left during the 1950s. So Blizzard decided to take the hardline route, similar to what Colin Kaepernick has experienced. So Blitzchung was stripped of title and prize money, which has been partially reinstated now, and the 2 Blizzard contractors who ran the interview were fired. This opened up waves of criticism and led to a wildcat strike by Blizzard employees who wanted to register their protest at what was happening, and also, in many cases, sometimes it was motivated by a desire to support the Hong Kong protests directly, and sometimes it was motivated by an opposition to censorship. So what are the protests about? How do they relate to Tencent, if at all? And what do people think on both sides? Well, to understand that, I think we need to look at Hong Kong's history. So, Hong Kong's history is largely misunderstood in the West, and Hong Kong became part of China about 2.25 millennia ago. First as a fishing village and a salt mine, and then later as a port. Now, Britain invaded China in the 19th century with the goal of forcing China to remove import restrictions on opium. And yes, that is the same opium that is a precursor to heroin. This was known as the First Opium War. And when they were suing for peace after losing the war, the Qing dynasty ceded control of Hong Kong to Britain in the 1842 Treaty of Nanjing. Under British control, the country was intensely divided and was considerably more dictatorial than today, in my opinion. Dozens of protesters were killed in anti-government riots in 1956 and then again in 1967. Many people enthusiastically supported the British, many enthusiastically supported the Chinese, and so there was a large degree of tension within society. In 1984, British Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher signed an agreement, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and part of this declaration was to restore Chinese control over Hong Kong, starting in 1997, but with a 50-year phase-in period. So we're now about halfway through that phase-in period. And this is the basis for the Chinese nationalist claim that Hong Kong is part of China, was stolen from us, and must return to us. And their further claims that the protests are a ploy by the British and the Americans to weaken China by causing chaos. Now, don't view that, that's a view I don't share, but I think it's important to understanding the situation. So what's at stake? What's been happening this year and what's going on in Hong Kong at the moment? So the protests started when Carrie Lam, who's Hong Kong's chief executive, their equivalent of an American president or an Australian prime minister, she staked her political career on a law that would allow a criminal extradition treaty with China. Actually, it didn't specify China in the actual extradition treaty law, but it was clear that that was the target. It was the fundamentals of the law was that Hong Kong's chief executive, i.e. the Prime Minister, would be able to intervene and authorise extraditions on a case-by-case basis to countries where there was no existing extradition treaty. Now, according to Carrie Lam's supporters, this would prevent corrupt business people who were wanted in China for various crimes from hiding in Hong Kong. That's her position, at least her publicly stated one. According to Carrie Lam's opponents, it would allow internal dissidents to be disappeared into mainland Chinese jails, and for dissidents that were not committing offences against Hong Kong's laws, but that were committing offences against Chinese laws, for them to conceivably be extradited as well and disappeared. So peaceful protests against the law begun and were attacked by police and stood their ground. This repression that the demonstrations faced was worse than anything seen in Australia since the Depression era, or in the United States since the LA riots, but was not comparable to the bloodshed that was seen, with the dozens that were killed during the LA riots, or some of the shootings that took place in Australia in the Depression era during strikes. The clearest parallel that I could draw from a Western country to the level of violence that's been inflicted on these protesters was probably the anti-poll tax protests that turned into riots against Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1990s in the UK. As well as the protests, there were also widespread strikes, as well as companies that actually took public anti-extradition law stances in Hong Kong. And those companies would actually close production on the strike days. So a very rare combination where you've got labour strikes happening at the same time as a capital strike. Now, following a number of extrajudicial beatings that were inflicted on protesters and severe prison terms that were given out, the protesters weren't cowed and they added new demands. No longer was this a movement just against the extradition law, it became a movement demanding that Carrie Lam stand down, that there be an independent commission of inquiry implemented into the police actions, and that the police publicly apologise for calling the demonstration on the 12th of June a riot. I do think it's important to state this isn't an anti-Chinese influence protest. It's a demonstration fundamentally that is against the Hong Kong government. But because the Chinese government fiercely supports Carrie Lam's administration, they end up being a minor player in the forces that are arrayed against the protesters. The main targets of the protesters haven't been Chinese firms, but they've instead been Hong Kong firms that are seen to collaborate with the police. And most notably, this includes the public transportation system, privately owned, which after the 31st of August incident at Prince Edward Station, in which police in riot gear stormed a train and started belting the shit out of everyone on it, whether they were a protester or not, this opposition to Hong Kong-owned companies that were seen to be collaborating with the police increased. This incident at Prince Edward Station is being described by some as the Prince Edward terror attack, and whilst official reports claim no fatalities, many of the protesters believe that this is a lie, and there is a morning vigil that was set up outside Prince Edward Station that I believe is still staffed to this day by people holding vigils there. I do think it's important to say that whilst I'm firmly on the side of the protesters, as I've stated, there is of course also a sizable section of Hong Kong society that backs Lam and that has trust in the police. Just as during other political protest movements around the world that have threatened to topple governments, there have always been people against the movements. An example of this from history, and this is living history for my parents' generation, when opposition to the Vietnam War saw protests of a similar scale in Australia, there was always a core of people that supported the war completely and that supported police attempts to forcibly disperse, to wound, to jail, or even kill anti-war protesters, and that attended pro-war events as well. Now, this is the political position that most Chinese nationalists will fall into. People that live within China or that feel some degree of loyalty to the Chinese government. Maybe they've grown up there and they've migrated somewhere else, and they, broadly speaking, support the direction that the Chinese government has taken throughout the last few decades. They're pretty happy with this, with the country that they grew up in's progress, and they see it as being somewhat of a shining light on the hill. Now, you've noticed that I haven't talked about China's role much yet. And that's because although the Chinese state has picked its side, and they're all the way with Carrie Lam, and they've made that very clear, they haven't been particularly active participants. The prison sentences that Hong Kong's protesters have faced have been imposed by Carrie Lam's courts and under Carrie Lam's laws, not by Xi Jinping's. The salaries of the police that carried out the Prince Edward attacks were paid by Lam's government, not by Beijing. And I think the Chinese state learnt a lot from the atrocities it committed in June of 1989. Not in a moral sense. I don't doubt for a second that Jinping wouldn't give similar orders today in a similar situation. But what they did learn was from a tactical sense. The regime in 1989 faced incredible difficulty finding soldiers that would carry out the orders and conduct the massacres that took place both in Tiananmen Square and in the surrounding area on the night of the 4th of June of 1989. For several weeks, soldiers refused to obey orders, they fraternised with the protesters there, and it was only when troops with recent hardening in battle were recalled from front lines and drugged up that they were able to carry out the massacres of June 4. We've seen a similar dynamic in other dictatorships as well. Bashar al-Assad's forces faced mass defections when he ordered similar massacres to what took place in Tiananmen Square. Actually, many of Assad's may even have been worse. He had massive defections at all levels of government and military during that period, and barely hung on to his regime's survival. Many other regimes have fallen after ordering similar atrocities. I don't think for that reason that China wants to intervene that directly, not for any moral reason, but for purely strategic ones. And so they're confident to provide moral, diplomatic support to carry Lam and potentially some material support, but I don't think that they're going to send in the troops or anything like that. One last point on why Chinese nationalism is so publicly prevalent, and why it's sort of such an unquestioned ideology amongst Chinese companies and many expats. In China, over the last generation, living standards have soared. In 1994, so 25 years ago, China was a low-wage economy, whereas by 2019, it's a medium-wage economy. A person that was born in 1976, so just a few years older than me, who's always worked in factories, will have experienced grinding poverty at 18, earning $2 or $3 a day. By 2010, median wages had risen to about $6 to $10 a day, and now they're closer to $20 a day. I'm not necessarily able to afford an iPhone, but people have gone from having a life with basically no luxuries at all to being able to save, to being able to purchase major purchases. No longer is it the case that only the wealthiest, that only the wealthiest of people, the supervisor in the factory foreman or the like, that is able to afford a refrigerator at home. Now, the working class people in China can afford a refrigerator, can afford a washing machine, can often afford a car, if not a nice one. And so this sharp increase in living standards has led to two main political positions in China. There's one section of people that say the government is doing a great job and wind up with fierce loyalty to the regime. And then there's also a minority who think the top end makes so much money from our hard work and we still only get a tiny piece of it. They're ripping us off every bit as much today as they ripped us off in the 90s when things were worse. And many of these people are inspired by the increased living standards to have rising expectations and feel emboldened by their increased ability to spend time on living for themselves and maybe political agitation. Political protests within China happen more than is reported, but information is somewhat sketchy. Since 2005, labour unions have been growing, strikes and riots have been more frequent. Unlike the United States of America, China is a very polarised society politically. However, it's a bit different in the sense that it does seem that the nationalist viewpoint is the majority and is a large majority there. Now, Xi Jinping's regime is somewhat dictatorial, but it's not the indestructible, universally supported monolith that a lot of people will assume. It's certainly nothing like the most extreme police state that I can think of that existed during my lifetime, which would be Nicolae Ceausescu's Stalinist Romania. During Ceausescu's regime, some reports indicate that 15% of people were on the direct payroll of the secret police, and that regime fell in 1989. So certainly, a powerful ideological control apparatus, a powerful repressive apparatus, was not something that was able to keep Ceausescu and his regime alive. Nor is it as dictatorial as, for example, the previous Iranian regime, the one that fell in 1979, during a period of turmoil that then would eventually lead to the current despotism there. During 1978, the regime of the Shahs conducted multiple massacres every month against the protest movement. Again, significantly worse than anything that has been seen in Hong Kong lately. So that's a bit of background, and hopefully it helps formulate a position on where you stand. And once more, it is coming from someone that does unconditionally support the protests in Hong Kong and wants them to achieve all of their goals, including, but not limited to, the removal of Carrie Lam as the chief executive. So, let's talk quickly about Tencent. Tencent are a very large company that are the majority owners of grinding gear games now. So they're a tech giant with about $100 billion in assets and about $50 billion in debts. So they're a massive company, but think more the size of Uber Technologies than the size of Amazon or Saudi Aramco or Google or Facebook. Now, Tencent own or have controlling shares in many game studios in the West, including Riot Games, Grinding Gear Games, and Supercell, and they have minority stakes in Activision Blizzard, in Epic Games, and in Ubisoft, among others. They're generally known for a pretty hands-off approach to ownership, leaving the management structures of the companies they acquire mostly intact. They're also very big outside gaming. They're attempting to build a serious rival to Alibaba, which is a Chinese mega company that doesn't really have a household name American variant. But what Alibaba does is it acts as a middleman between sellers of commercial quantities of goods and buyers and their buyers. So for example, if you wanted a single custom t-shirt printed for your own use, you wouldn't turn to Alibaba for that. But if you wanted 250 copies of that shirt in order to on-sell, or if you wanted 25,000 copies of that shirt in order to on-sell, Alibaba could connect you to a supplier that could meet those needs, and then in turn would take a percentage of the money that you paid for producing those shirts. Tencent also want to get in on that market, so the wholesale supply side of things. In many ways, I think Tencent reflect what Amazon was like when it wasn't a trillion-dollar conglomerate, but was the size Tencent is today, a company that's big enough to buy its way into new markets. And the acquisition of Grinding Gear Games by Tencent reminds me in a lot of ways of Amazon acquiring Audible Studios in 2008. So just as Amazon saw that Audible Studios had a product that they were the market leaders in something that synergized with the rest of their business, because Amazon at that point were really working hard on the Kindle. Amazon thought, all right, we're the market leaders in ebooks. We can be the market leaders in audiobooks as well if we just buy the market leader in audiobooks. And Tencent, in a similar way, saw that the market leaders in the action RPG side of things, because Tencent being a conglomerate that has a lot of gaming, they saw that Grinding Gear Games was one of two market leaders in the action RPG genre, and they thought, well, we have a business relationship with them already. Let's put out some feelers and see if we could acquire them, and eventually those feelers led to the acquisition about a year ago of 80% of shares in Grinding Gear Games by Tencent. Essentially, though, the only connections between Tencent and the Blizzard incident are that Tencent are small minority shareholders in Blizzard, and the fact that they're Chinese. Now, we'll point out that Epic Games had a pretty good position in terms of this incident with Blitzchung. Epic Games basically publicly opposed what Blizzard did, and Epic Games actually are more heavily owned by Tencent than Activision Blizzard are. So I feel that the 5% stake in Blizzard that Tencent owns doesn't really make Tencent responsible directly for the Blitzchung incident, at least in my mind. This was a decision of individual managers at Blizzard, not something that's been an edict that's passed down to them, from the Chinese Communist Party to Tencent, and then from Tencent to Blizzard, who've then gone and carried it out. The most likely reason, I believe, for Blizzard's decision was a very wrong judgment call by senior managers, who made a business decision that being seen to be soft and not suppressing Blitzchung's statement would hurt sales amongst gamers that were influenced by Chinese nationalist politics, and that cracking down would have minimal or no backlash amongst people who supported the Hong Kong anti-government protests. Now, I see no evidence of the Chinese regime pushing Tencent on this, nor of Tencent being a particularly political company either. This is somewhat different to the case of Cathay Pacific Airlines, who were actually intervened into very heavily. They had a management restructure imposed on them after they were seen to be too tolerant of the protests. Ultimately, for this reason, I can't see any reason to boycott Tencent over this incident, even though I assume that Tencent's directors mostly would politically support the Lam government. They aren't actively involved in Lam's actions, and the protesters on the ground aren't calling for people to boycott random Chinese companies, maybe Chinese companies that are actually involved in supplying batons to the police. That would, if for instance, Alibaba was involved in doing that, and I'm not alleging that they are, then the people in Hong Kong might appreciate a boycott of Alibaba. However, they're not making any calls for random Chinese companies to be boycotted. However, I did cancel my World of Warcraft sub over this incident. I might have done so anyway, as I wasn't really feeling World of Warcraft Classic, but this did push me over the edge into deciding to do it now rather than maybe doing so later. So in summary, I feel this is fundamentally the protest movement in Hong Kong is fundamentally a movement against their own government, with China's role being limited to being active supporters of the government that the protesters are against. I wholly endorse the protests there and condemn Blizzard's actions in trying to suppress, in trying and very, very, very badly failing at suppressing Blitzchung's political statement. but I urge you to review the arguments of both sides and make up your own mind. Anyways, if you've got any questions there, definitely fire away. I will just reiterate that I'm not intending for this to be anything more than a once-off video, so it's something that's a divergence from what I normally do that's being put out because it's been probably the biggest controversy in gaming of 2019. So I will be back to my normal Path of Exile specific programming in future, but if you've got any questions or comments about this, definitely do fire away below. Disagreements as well, be interesting. I'd really be interested to get positions from more people that are influenced by the Chinese nationalist perspective on this, because I don't know any personally. I have tried to get second-hand accounts from people that do know them, but it would be interesting to get that perspective as well. I doubt you'll convince me, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Anyways, that's all I got. If you got any questions, fire away. Otherwise, I'll leave it there. Hope you have a good one.